recommendation I was going to fire Comey, knowing there was no good time to do it. And in fact, when I decided to just do it, I said to myself, I said, you know, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story.
Good morning and welcome to AM Joy. Let's go back, shall we, to May 2017. Donald Trump had only been in office for 5 months and had just fired FBI Director James Comey. The official reason for the firing was Comey's handling of the Hillary Clinton email investigation. But Trump couldn't manage to stick to the official line, as you just heard. He told NBC's Lester Holt that the firing was about the Russia thing. Now, almost 2 years later, we know that that interview caught the attention of the FBI, which, according to a bombshell report in the New York Times, opened a counterintelligence investigation, prompting this sentence in the New York Times report, which I am quite confident has never been uttered about an American president. Quote, in the days after President Trump fired James Comey as the FBI director, law enforcement officials became so concerned by the president's behavior that they began investigating whether he had been working on behalf of Russia against American interests. Now just let that sink in for a minute. The Times cites 2 instances that led them to open this investigation: the aforementioned interview with Lester Holt and the unsent draft of a letter that Trump wanted to send to Comey about his firing, in which he again mentioned the Russia investigation. A draft that Special Counsel Robert Mueller has, according to a September 2017 report in the New York Times. Now, Mueller took over the counterintelligence investigation into Trump. He has it, and it's unclear whether it's still ongoing. But regardless, let's be clear. This is completely separate from the Russia investigation that was opened in 2016, which was about Russia's interference in our election to help elect Trump. This counterintelligence and criminal investigation was opened to scrutinize the conduct of the sitting president of the United States while he's in office. Let's bring in our mega panel to break this all down. Nayyera Haq, a former State Department senior advisor. Rick Wilson, Republican media strategist and author of Everything Trump Touches Dies. Former U.S. Attorney Barbara McQuade. David K. Johnston, author of It's Even Worse Than You Think. Elliot Williams, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General. Malcolm Nance, author of The Plot to Destroy Democracy. MSNBC legal analyst Benjamin Wittes. And joining by phone, former Assistant Director for Counterintelligence at the FBI, Frank Figliuzzi. And I'm going to start with you, Frank, on the phone. Thank you so much for calling in and talk to us this morning. So many things about this are extraordinary. To me, the most extraordinary is that we had come to think over these 2.5 years that there were 2 investigations that were going on. One of them into what we kind of broadly call Russiagate, Russia's interference in our election. Another into obstruction of justice, which was thought to be the firing of Comey and whether it was impeding the probe. What's extraordinary here is that, and I'm going to go to Ben Wittes after I go to you, is that the 2 might be the same thing. That you have the FBI, which was reluctant to get involved during the election, now investigating whether a sitting president of the United States was an ongoing Russian asset. Just give us your broad thoughts on this new reporting.
Sure, Joy. Thanks for having me. I think this is just particularly sobering, even for career counterintelligence professionals who always kind of in the back of their minds think there's an outside possibility that someone could rise to high office who might really be playing for another team. To see this in writing, to hear this report, it's accurate to say that the Bureau actually opened a case on Donald J. Trump is really hitting the American people in the gut. So from a professional side, we have to understand what this means. It means likely, Joy, that even though the article is citing the behavior, the public behavior of the president, as you just noted, in order to get this to pass muster, in order to get this through FBI headquarters, through teams of lawyers, across the street to Department of Justice, having them approve the president in the name of the title line of an investigation, I am virtually certain that more evidence than just the public behavior of the president is involved in this. And I think that evidence is likely classified evidence.
And on that point, Frank, I want to stay with you for a minute. Because of the job that you did, you, of course, are the former assistant director for counterintelligence. These are the kind of investigations that you've done, although I dare say I'm sure you've never done them into the president of the United States. That is still mind-blowing for me. But there's another piece of information. I won't take credit for this. I saw this, somebody else who was talking about it online, that pointed me back to a January 12, 2017 article, also in the New York Times, that talks about the fact that the National Security Agency, the NSA, which does signals intelligence, meaning, you know, intercepted phone calls, that kind of thing, that they got more latitude to share intercepted communications, something they normally would have had to jump through a lot of hoops to get. And here's a little poll quote from it. The change means that far more officials will be searching through raw data. Essentially, the government is reducing the risk that the NSA will fail to recognize that a piece of information would be valuable to another agency, but increasing the risk that officials will see private information about innocent people. But the bottom line here is that long-standing limits on what the NSA could have, I mean, what the NSA could share with the FBI, those long-standing limits were relaxed. Does that tell you, as a former assistant director for counterintelligence of the FBI, that the FBI might have intercepted phone communications, intercepted signals intelligence about ongoing cooperation between the President of the United States and Russia?
So the short answer is yes. But I don't even think that those relaxed regulations may play into them or not. They might, but from day one, Joy, you've heard intelligence professionals saying there's much more to this iceberg than just the tip, and that is what we call the dark side, the SIGINT, the signals intelligence, the intercepts worldwide. And let's not just say that it's the American intelligence community. We know from reporting throughout this case that allied partners have shared intelligence, whether it's Australians or Brits or others. So all of that working together could, and this is really the hard part to get your arms around, that literally our allies may have been helping, and our intelligence community may have been supporting a case and evidence development against our own president.
Wow. And we know that the George Papadopoulos information was sourced when he was meeting with, you know, with a professor from another country, that where that information then winds up back in the hands of the FBI. I want to go, before I go to Ben, I'm going to come to you in a minute, Ben, but I want to go to Malcolm really quickly, because we've been now at this for what, almost 3 years, 2.5 years, and the question was always whether or not Donald Trump was an asset, witting or unwitting, of a foreign power, of Russia. It's pretty hard, you know, clear, I think, to most people that Russia's interference in the election was to help him. That's the testimony that we have from everyone who's testified before Congress. But whether or not he was also helping them was, I guess, the big question. Here is a picture that I want to show you that we're all familiar with. This is Donald Trump meeting in the Oval Office with Sergei Lavrov and Sergei Kislyak, who were the Russian foreign minister and Russian ambassador to the U.S. respectively. That meeting, Malcolm, takes place on May 10, 2017, which is the day after Jim Comey was fired as FBI director. The New York Times reports that Trump told the Russians at that meeting that he fired Comey and eased pressure on himself from the investigation into Russian interference. In light of what we now know about the New York Times opening not their original investigation into the election interference, but this new thing about possible ongoing cooperation between the President of the United States and Russia, what do you make of that picture now?
Well, you might recall that on September 23rd, 2016, I published a book called The Plot to Hack America, where I projected that based on what we knew, Russia was carrying out this information warfare operation to elect Donald Trump. But Donald Trump, his staff, and all of his behaviors would lead me to believe that he was initially an unwitting asset of Russia. And then by the time he said, Russia, if you're listening, please hack, please give me Hillary Clinton's 33,000 emails, that he became a witting asset of Russia. And the further back that I looked, and other people have investigated, it became clear that Donald Trump was a wholly owned subsidiary of Vladimir Putin. And on this very channel, on Rachel Maddow in November 2016, I said that this was a national counterintelligence threat. That means the FBI and all U.S. intelligence would be on what we knew at the time, and now what we know was a spy hunt. That's what counterintelligence means. It means they are looking for U.S. citizens who are in communications or active activities with a foreign intelligence agency or government. This is nothing new. We're just learning now that the FBI officers, after the Lavrov meeting in the White House, suddenly realized that Donald Trump, his behaviors, his activities, and whether we have, collection from our sister intelligence agencies. I worked at NSA. I've done activities like that. It doesn't matter. The collective body of knowledge showed that the FBI's counterintelligence spy hunters thought Donald Trump was an asset enough that they started an investigation. And now, believe me, Robert Mueller has got a lot more information than they had. And I think this is going to end up that he was dirty.
It's extraordinary. Ben Wittes, I was reading this morning the Lawfare post that you put up on Friday that talked about what I was, brought up a little bit earlier, this question of whether the collusion and the obstruction, which we've all the time been talking about as two separate things, what if they were actually the same thing? A bit of an excerpt from your analysis at Lawfare is the following. In his congressional testimony this fall, as Schmidt, who is the New York Times reporter, and Goldman, the other New York Times reporter, had discovered, James Baker, who was the chief counsel of the FBI, made an arresting comment. The investigation was about Russia, period, full stop. The purpose of the investigation, he explained, was to assess what the Russians were up to with respect to the 2016 election. The FBI was trying to learn what the Russians had done and whether any Americans had done things in support of those efforts, either knowingly or unknowingly, so that they could understand the full scope of what the Russians had sought to do. And Ben, the reason that question came up is that the pushback on this investigation was that it was an attempt to essentially harass the President of the United States. But Mr. Baker made it very clear in the testimony that was read to these reporters, to Adam Goldman, Michael Schmidt, and Nicholas Fandos, the testimony that was read to them that he gave in private to the House Intelligence Committee is no, it's all about Russia. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so, it was about Russia. It was always about Russia, full stop. And, I think one of the problems that we've had as we've analyzed this and we've focused on the question of the president, right? Did the president do X? Did the president do Y? Is that you lose sight of the way the FBI understands the investigation. And from the FBI's point of view, this was an investigation of Russian activity with respect to the 2016 election. And as a subsidiary matter, the interactions or assistance that anybody had with that activity on this side of the Atlantic, that is, anybody who may have provided support to them. From the FBI's point of view, the purpose of this investigation was to understand and thwart Russian activity. It was not an investigation of the president. Then all of a sudden, the president of the United States swoops in, starts putting pressure on the FBI with respect to this investigation, in the case of Flynn, demanding things of it, and then turns around and fires the head of the agency. And all of a sudden, the FBI is saying, whoa, is the president's activity in trying to shut down the investigation itself a national security threat, to the extent that the investigation is important to the protection of national security? And I think that is, where
where that investigation, which has been an investigation of Russia, not of the president, becomes suddenly, as a subsidiary matter, also an investigation of the president's own conduct.
Yeah, and I think that's a very important point. I'll go to Barbara McQuaid on that, because that, I think, is the crux, right? We've had an ongoing investigation into the president's members of his campaign. His former campaign chairman has been pulled into it. Questions about what his attorney did. Questions about what his son and his son-in-law might have done at that infamous Trump Tower meeting. It's all been people close to the president. It's all been about Russia's efforts to assist Donald Trump in becoming president. This report is about the president. It's about his own activities, but also his own assertions that made him a target of an investigation. His own determination and insistence on including Russia in his purported case for firing Jim Comey. When his administration said it was about the Hillary Clinton investigation, he said, no, it's about Russia. He said it to Lester Holt. He said it in a letter he wanted to write to Jim Comey. And apparently he said it to the Russians. Donald Trump is now the target. Yes, am I right about that, Barbara?
Yes, and I think Ben does a wonderful job of framing this for the public. I think one thing that's important to understand is the context of how counterintelligence investigations work. Think of counterintelligence as the umbrella, and the goal is to detect and disrupt threats. That's the goal. And we were always taught that criminal prosecution, it may be criminal prosecution. And when you find Americans doing things like lying, making false statements, obstructing justice, those are the kinds of crimes that can emanate from that larger picture of counterintelligence. But the goal, as Ben says, has always been about Russia, learning about how and why and the methods by which Russia interfered with our election. That's what Robert Mueller is looking at. And I think this new revelation about Trump being the target of the investigation, as well as Ben's framing of it, has really clarified that point for the American public.
Yeah, it's pretty extraordinary. I'm gonna come back to Ben in a second, but I want to go to Elliot really quickly on the response. Just your take on it as an attorney, because the original response in the White House was just sort of all over the place. It was just sort of, you know, lashing out at President Obama and all sorts of other stuff that didn't really get to the substance. They actually didn't even address the substance. They just went on rants about Andrew McCabe and all of that sort of thing. But then Rudy Giuliani, who is a former prosecutor, a former mayor, somebody who purportedly knows something about the law. This is now his response. Now they've had time to breathe and think about it. Here's the response. If it was a counterintelligence investigation and it obtained any evidence, it would have resulted in some action being taken. Or are they imperiling our national security? This shows how out of control they are. I want to get your response to that, and then I want to get Frank's response to it, and then Ben's.
Okay, I can't count the number of times over the course of this investigation that Rudy Giuliani has fundamentally misstated the law in an attempt to throw people off the scent of the president's wrongdoing. He's doing it again. He did it going back to whether, you know, the DOJ could keep investigating during election season, and multiple times he has he's undermining the very integrity of the investigation by misstating the law. There's a difference, as some of the folks, as Frank had said before, and as Barbara, you know, there's a difference between counterintelligence investigations and criminal investigations, and certainly there may not have been charges that would have flown from a counterintelligence investigation. What they are seeking to do is ascertain the extent of the Russians or foreign actors' incursion into our matter. So again, I'm just getting flustered talking about it because it's so crazy. Because no, this is a former U.S. attorney, a former Associate Attorney General of the United States, misstating facts and misstating law. Nowhere in there is a denial of the allegations. And frankly, what I find to be the most interesting line in the article, and I'll read it to you right here, is no evidence has emerged publicly that Mr. Trump was secretly in contact with or took direction from Russian government officials. Ironically, I think that's the most incriminating line because they use the word publicly, that there's so much more, as Frank had said earlier, so much more evidence that we're not aware about that could potentially, that speaks to the level of Russian incursion here. And so, once again, it's same stuff, different day from the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, and it's quite disappointing. But at this point, we shouldn't be surprised by it at all.
Yeah, just really quickly, Frank, on Rudy Giuliani's response to the report, he says as if it's a counterintelligence investigation and it obtained any evidence, it would have resulted in some action, or they are imperiling our national security. As Ellie just mentioned, there typically are two different sort of lanes. You've got the counterintelligence investigation lane, you got the criminal investigation lane. Am I right in saying that counterintelligence investigations don't necessarily result in someone being arrested? They are counterintelligence because they're trying to continue to ascertain information.
Yeah, both Barbara and Malcolm have properly characterized the nature of a counter and purpose of a counterintelligence case, which is essentially to identify, penetrate, and neutralize. That could take years. You may recall the sleeper cell of 10 Russian illegals. That FBI case ran for 10 years before the FBI concluded they had wrapped up the entire cell, identified all of their covert communications and funding mechanisms, and then and only then did they decide to take it down for a number of reasons. So the arrest or overt action is not the goal at all. In fact, public action is contrary to the goal of a counterintelligence case, which is simply identify and even mess with and make life hard for your adversary. So as Rudy comes out and says this kind of thing, he's just fulfilling his mission for public relations and to twist and turn. But the American people need to understand that the FBI is there to do the right thing. No one's above the law. No one at any level can be allowed to join forces with a foreign adversary, and the American people should want an FBI that actually is unafraid to open a case and take a look under that rock. And that's exactly what they did.
Ben, just quoting from your article again. Oh, I'm sorry. Who is jumping in there?
This is Elliot.
Oh, Elliot. Go ahead.
It actually would have been irresponsible, I think, for the FBI not to, based on that information that was out there and based on the totality of everything from Russia, are you listening, to Michael Flynn's conduct, and on and on and on. For the FBI, and even frankly, as Malcolm would say, our allies overseas and their intelligence entities to have looked into this.
Absolutely.
So just want to get that in there.
No, absolutely.
Can I just add to that?
Sure.
Actually, Giuliani is wrong on a different point. It did result in a immediate action, which was the appointment of Bob Mueller. If the concern was the president perhaps wittingly or unwittingly is operating on behalf of the Russians to shut down this investigation, the urgent task was to protect the investigation. So what did Rod Rosenstein do? He appointed a special prosecutor, a special counsel, Bob Mueller, immediately, and transferred the entire investigative authority under the regs to that person. So the premise of Giuliani's point is quite wrong. If there was a counterintelligence concern, which there appears to have been, it resulted in an immediate overt action to protect the investigation whose integrity they were concerned about.
Yeah, absolutely. Rick Wilson, what do you make, first of all, of the responses, the White House statement, which I'm probably going to read because it's kind of just sputtering. And I mean, they had to have been flustered. I was flustered reading it, when this dropped last night. So they had to have been flustered. But even when they had time to think about it, what do you make of the Giuliani response?
Well, Joy, I think the response from my old boss, Rudy, and from the White House, and from Sarah Sanders, and from the president's crazy rage tweeting this morning, it all comes down to this. There's no denial embedded in their responses at all. They are not denying this. What they are saying is that we're going to attack Jim Comey, we're going to attack Andy McCabe, we're going to attack the FBI, we're going to attack the DOJ. All of it comes down to the fact that Donald Trump, his consciousness of guilt is screaming out of all of these responses. They are hoping they can just throw more bait out there to the Trump base and that they'll stick with him. But this is one more brick in this actual wall around Donald Trump, where the proof of his collusion with Russia, the proof of his conspiracy of his campaign to cooperate with Russia, his longstanding business ties with Russia, and his post-presidency or his post-election behavior toward Russia, has raised not just a few red flags, but a whole sea of red flags. And I think that their responses are so insufficient politically and certainly legally. I'm not a lawyer, but neither on the political side or the legal side does it seem that these folks have got their message together, because there's not a real defense here. If Donald Trump said these things to Lester Holt, he said these things in the Oval Office to the Russians. God knows what he said to Putin in Helsinki behind closed doors.
Yeah,
this is a rising tide of trouble for this president.
Yeah, he said them over the, I mean, he was advised not to say them. I mean, the thing that's extraordinary here is that he does have counsel. The White House counsel is there for him. He was advised by counsel, don't say these things to Jim Comey in this letter. Don't send this letter. He insists that he must say it. He couldn't help, it's almost he couldn't help himself. He had to say it. He said it to Lester Holt. He's the reason he's being investigated in a counterintelligence probe. It's extraordinary. I want to come to Nayyera here because I wonder, you know, as we're digesting this here, you know, here on set, here in the U.S., here at NBC, and all around the United States, I think the reaction of a lot of people is shock. An American president being investigated as to whether he is working in the interest of a foreign country. Shocking. As a former State Department spokesperson, what do you suspect our allies are thinking as they're digesting this? What are foreign ambassadors thinking as they read this story this morning?
It used to be that the United States was not only operating on potentially equal footing with Russia in many parts of the world, but dominating Russia in part of the world. And now we have a president of the United States who is executing Russian policy and putting out Kremlin lines about how we should be throughout the rest of the world. The Syria withdrawal was shocking to everybody, including our own military. We lost our Secretary of Defense because the President of the United States decided that Russian perspective about what should happen in Syria and backing the Assad regime was more important. Randomly, the president decides to talk about how Russian intervention in Afghanistan 20 years ago was justified, even though the President of the United States at the time, Ronald Reagan, was on the opposite side. So this goes well beyond any party lines and party traditions, and he is now executing Russian national security policy internationally and domestically. Let's not forget that the Russians got a spy into the NRA who was trying to amp up and talk about how white nationalist movements can be empowered. The Department of Justice at the time decided that white nationalist movements and militias were no longer the biggest threat to the United States. All of this is exactly what Putin does in his own country, and he would like to now see the United States as an extension of Russia.
Yeah, indeed. David K. Johnston, Ronald Reagan, who Donald Trump, let's not forget, thought about running against in 1988, having published in multiple newspapers with the help of his friend Roger Stone an op-ed decrying U.S. policy toward the then Soviet Union. So it's not, this isn't a new thing for Donald Trump.
Well, Donald has no sense of history. He has no moral core of any kind. And so from Donald's mind, what's going on here in the investigation of Russia and what I've always seen as being interconnected, the effort to stop the investigation, to obstruct